So it's my great pleasure to introduce one of the deepest and most prolific economists, Joe Stiglitz. Joe is a superb academic who has extensively applied his expertise in the political sphere, as well as in the journals. Joe is famous for studies of the effects of asymmetric information, for which he won the Nobel Prize in 2001. He's one of the earliest to apply game theoretic reasoning for studying policy issues. His work revolutionized the study of credit markets, insurance, development, and the theory of the firm, where he is responsible for the concept of efficiency wages. You should all like efficiency wages. That's what gets us paid more than the competition. He served in the Clinton administration as the chair of the President's Council on Economic Advisors. He also served as chief economist of the World Bank, where he's noted for criticizing the World Bank. He's a co-author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. More recently, Joe Stiglitz has been advising Obama, but has also been sharply critical of the Obama administration's financial industry rescue plan. To give a quote, he said, "Whoever designed the bank rescue plan is either in the pocket of the banks or incompetent." And I hope he will tell us which. Without further ado, let me introduce one of the best economists, Joe Stiglitz.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here again. The subject, of course, that I'm talking about is not so attractive. The topic is the price of inequality, how today's divided society endangers our future. The book grew out of an article that I wrote in Vanity Fair. Vanity Fair is maybe not the usual media for academics to publish in, but the Vanity Fair article did get more attention than my 1969 Econometrica article on the same subject. The title of the Vanity Fair article that went viral was of the 1% for the 1%, of the 1% by the 1% for the 1%, and you can sort of get the tone of the article, and it got picked up by part of the chant of the Occupy Wall Street. The issues that I'm talking about are not the politics of envy, as one of the political candidates has said. One of the political candidates said you shouldn't be talking about inequality except in quiet rooms and hushed tones. But in fact, I believe that inequality is one of the most important problems our society faces today and needs to be talked about actually quite loudly. What most Americans do not realize is that quietly, without people noticing it, America has become the advanced industrial country with the highest level of inequality. And we were already had that distinction a number of years ago, but while other countries have worked hard to contain the inequality, to slow the increase, in recent years, the level of inequality in the United States has been increasing markedly. Just a couple of examples. The share of income that accrues to the upper 1% has doubled from 10% in 1980 to 20% today. There are a number of other statistics that describe the degree of inequality, but perhaps one or two I think that maybe I should mention in the beginning here. One of them is that Americans like to think of our country as a land of opportunity. It really defines part of the American identity. But in fact, that notion that America is a land of opportunity is really a myth. Now, we all know people who've made it from the bottom to the top, middle to the top, immigrants who've come to the United States and succeeded. But from the point of view of an economist, what's relevant is the statistics. No, not the examples, not the exceptions, but what happens on average. And on average, America is less equal even than old Europe, let alone any of the other advanced industrial countries for which there's data. What does that mean? It means that the life prospects of a young kid in the United States is more dependent on the education and income of his parents than in any other country. And you can see it gets reflected in a number of aspects, both in terms of movement up, but also movement down. People at the top who whose children don't do very well in school wind up with higher income than people from the bottom and middle whose children do very well in school. So it really shows the influence of parents in determining opportunity in the United States. Some of you may have seen the article that appeared yesterday reflecting the outcome results of the Fed survey of wealth and income in the United States, the most recent one. And it was very, very telling. You know, it'd be one thing if all that success at the top benefited everybody. And the idea that that was so is called trickle-down economics. You know, you throw enough money at the top and everybody benefits. But the evidence is to the contrary. That while the top has done very well, the median, people, you know, 50% below, 50% above, median income in the United States today is lower than it was a decade and a half ago. And what's been happening to wealth is even more troubling. The top 1% controls about 40% of all the wealth. But the recession was really, really bad for most Americans, not only in terms of income, but even more so in terms of wealth. Not a surprise, but with people at the bottom and middle putting all their wealth into the homes, when the home prices went down on average over 30%, in some areas over 50%, they lost a very large fraction of their wealth. So in fact, the wealth, particularly at the middle and the bottom, is now back to where it was over 2 decades ago. No increase in wealth over 2 decades. In the recovery from the crisis in 2010, we got another picture of the degree of inequality in our society. 93% of the growth that occurred in 2010 went to the upper 1%. So again, most Americans are not sharing in what's going on. It would be one thing, as I said, if the success of those at the top, the income, benefited everybody, but it hasn't. And also it would be one thing if the successes at the top reflected their contribution to society. This is not about envy. The question is, have they really made contributions that are commensurate with their incomes? And those of you who study elementary economics know this. This is a 19th century theory called the marginal productivity theory. Well, the crisis actually gave lie to that theory. We all saw in the crisis the bankers walking off with huge bonuses, even though they brought the global economy to the brink of ruin, even though they brought their own company to the brink of ruin. In fact, some of the banks were so embarrassed about calling these bonuses performance bonuses that they changed the name to retention bonuses. There was no performance, so they had to have another name. But then the question was, why would you want to retain somebody who had messed up your company so badly? And all this actually speaks to one of the key issues that I raise in the book. What is the true source of wealth of those, say, at the top? If you look at the list of people at the top, it doesn't include the great innovators, you know, the people who invented the computer, Turing. It doesn't include the people who invented the transistor, the laser, the discovered DNA. None of these people who really made important contributions to our society are in that list of the wealthiest in our society. It's basically, what the argument I have is a very large proportion of these are people that economists call rent seekers. Now, let me try to explain what the concept of rent seeking is. You can see it in a couple of ways. There are two ways to create wealth, to get wealth. One of them is to make the size of the national pie larger and to get a share of that increase. The other one is to try to seize a larger share of the existing pie. And that's what rent seekers do. And in that process, they actually make the pie smaller. So an example are monopolists. How do monopolists make their profits? Partly by restricting output. They're making the output actually smaller than it otherwise would be. And yet, that can generate large incomes for themselves. So if you look at the disproportionately the people at the top, they are in this group of what economists will call rent seeker. Let me give you a couple other examples. When the bankers engage in predatory lending or abusive credit card practices, what they're doing is moving money. They're not creating value. What they're doing is taking money from poor Americans, financially unsophisticated Americans, and moving it from the bottom to the top. That doesn't create wealth. It actually, in some sense, destroys wealth. Why does it destroy wealth? Well, one of the most important resources of any society are their human talent, the young people. And when you devote those people to this task of moving money from the poor people for predatory lending, you're misallocating your scarcest human resource. So it's not a surprise, and this is really one of the most important points of the book, it's not a surprise that economies in which the divide is larger, when their inequality is larger, grow more slowly. You see that in the history of the United States. In the period, in the decades after World War II, we had just fought a war together and there was a sense of national cohesiveness. We passed laws like the GI Bill that provided education for all. The result of that was our economy went through the most rapid period of economic growth, and it was a period in which every part of our economy grew, but those at the bottom grew most rapidly, so that the divide between the top and the bottom got reduced. Since 1980, what has happened is growth has slowed and the divide has grown. And that's not an accident. And one of the things I try to do in the book is to try to explain why there is this negative correlation between inequality and growth, why inequality is bad for economic growth. And there are a couple factors that help explain it. One of them is this phenomenon of rent seeking that I just described, that resources got misallocated to seeking rents rather than to producing increasing value. And there are a whole list of the kinds of rent-seeking activities. When the drug companies spend money to persuade Congress to give them a to pass a law that says the U.S. government, while it's the largest purchaser of drug, cannot bargain with the drug companies, the result of which gives the drug companies a gift over 10 years of $500 billion. Money that could go into making our economy more productive. That's rent-seeking activity that does not lead to a stronger economy. When we have a tax law, again, as a result of lobbying, that says that speculators should be taxed at less than half the rate that those who work for a living, because of the special provisions of capital gains, we're distorting our economy. More resources move into speculation, less into creative activity, and again, our economy is weaker. It's also, of course, not fair, and it's one of the reasons that the top 1% pays an average tax rate of 15%, which is much less than those whose income is substantially lower. There are other reasons that inequality is bad for our economy. For an economy to work well, there needs to be a basic level of public spending on what you might call the common good. You have to have investments in education, public education. One of the reasons why we've become a less equal society is that we are not investing as much in public education. People in California know that access to the university is becoming much less restricted. It's not as open as it was 30 years ago. And these are things that mean that many young people are not going to live up to their potential, and again, a waste of resources. You need to invest in technology. Google, a lot of the most important innovations of the recent decades are based on government-funded research. The internet was supported by government-funded research. We've been living off of draining the well of ideas that basic research helped support, but we haven't been refilling the well. And that requires government support of National Science Foundation, NIH, all kinds of things. We've underfunded those. And finally, you need infrastructure. Any of you who've come into Kennedy Airport know that America has been underinvesting in our infrastructure. A comparison between U.S. airports and those in Asia is embarrassing. But you need ports and roads if you're going to export, if you're going to grow. So we've been underinvesting in these things. And one of the reasons we have is when you have a divided society, those at the top worry that if you have too strong of a government, it might use its powers to redistribute. And so they'd rather have a weak government that can't do anything, that's tied up, that's gridlocked, than a government that might engage in redistribution. I'll come back to that in the end. But the point of all these are just some of the mechanisms by which inequality leads to poor economic performance. There's one more final one I want to mention that's gotten a lot of attention more recently. It's not a surprise that the last time inequality reached the kind of level that it's reached more recently in the United States was during the Roaring '20s, right before the Great Depression. And the IMF, the UN Commission that investigated the global financial crisis, other scholars have come to the consensus that instability, that inequality is systematically associated with instability. If we have time later in the question period, I could try to go through the mechanism by which that happens, but it is a regularity. And so, one way of thinking about it is when you move money, the people at the top save a larger fraction of their income than people at the bottom. So when you move money from the bottom to the top, there's a lack of demand, or there would be a lack of demand unless something is done about it. And what the Fed did about it was to create a bubble. And it worked for a while, but it put our economy in jeopardy. And this has happened not only this time, but it's happened on other occasions. So all of these are reasons why greater inequality is associated with weaker economic performance. And that's really one of the main themes of the book, of The Price of Inequality. We're paying a high price for this inequality. This is a markedly different perspective than taken by those on the right. Those on the right say, we understand you don't like inequality, and we wish we could get rid of inequality, but we can't without paying a very high price. Now, old textbook used to talk about a trade-off. You can get lower inequality, but at the cost of lower growth, less economic efficiency. There's a trade-off. So that what they said, in fact, was that the price that not only the top would pay, but everybody would have to pay if we try to reduce the degree of inequality is just too high. What my book argues is quite the contrary, that in fact we are paying a price for not attacking inequality. that we could have, as I say, a stronger economy and a more equal society. One of the concerns I have is that this inequality then starts to affect not only our economy, but our democracy, our system of justice, budget battles, the conduct of macroeconomic policy. I'll try to explain in a few minutes how inequality has this kind of pervasive effect on our society. Before that, I want to discuss a puzzle that arises in political science, in political theory. We're supposed to have a democracy, and in a democracy with one person, one vote, the outcome of the democracy is supposed to reflect the middle. There's a well-developed theory that some of you may have studied called the median voter, that the median voter half want more spending, half want less spending. And you can go through any issue, and the median voter theory describes it's the person in the middle that's supposed to be determining where our polity goes. But if you look at the United States, you look at the decisions that we've made in our politics, it's very clear that that doesn't describe what's going on. If you look at what's going on, it's better described by a theory of $1, one vote than one person, one vote. And the question is why? Because we have a democracy. Why is the outcome so different? Well, in discussing the economics and how the economy leads to the degree of inequality that we have, what I point out is that it's not just market forces. Market forces are universal. They affect countries all over the world. But the way we shape market forces has resulted in the US having more inequality than any other country. So laws and regulation help shape market forces. An example, for instance, is take a bankruptcy law. Every country has a bankruptcy law, but we are distinct. We have two provisions in our bankruptcy law that is distinctive, are distinctive. One of them is at the top, we give priority to derivatives. That says that if a company goes bankrupt, the derivatives, the CDSs, are paid off before anybody else, before workers, before anybody else. And we have a law like that that encourages derivatives, these speculative products. Remember that AIG had a $150 billion bailout? That was a result of government encouraging this through our bankruptcy law. At the other end, this may be a sensitive subject, but in the United States, we have another distinctive provision of our bankruptcy law that students cannot discharge their loans even in bankruptcy, even if the school does not provide the education that they promised. You know, in other areas of our life, we say, companies say, satisfaction guaranteed or your money back. These for-profit schools say satisfaction is almost guaranteed not to occur because dropout rates are huge, but you'll never get your money back, and in fact, we're going to be on your shoulders for the rest of your life. Well, that's a result of politics, of the laws that we pass that shape our economy, that encourage people to provide education that doesn't really serve the needs because they can't get their money back. Well, the same thing is true about politics. That the way our political system works is shaped by the rules and regulations. If you have rules and regulations that say, for instance, affecting lobbying, campaign contributions, revolving doors, they determine the influence of the 1%, of the people at the top. So like the Citizens United, the Supreme Court decision that allowed corporations to give unbridled spending gave more influence to those at the top. The consequence of this is that we have a vicious circle where economic inequality feeds into inequality of political power, and that inequality of political power leads to rules and regulations that lead to more economic inequality in a what I would call a downward vicious circle. In some ways, it's even worse than I've just described, because as ordinary citizens see this process in work, they become disillusioned. They say, what good is it to vote? And you see the consequence of that in the last election in 2010, where 80% of the young people said it wasn't worth their while to exercise their democratic right to vote. It's astounding. Other countries are marching to get the right to vote. Countries trying to get democracy. We have democracy, but 80% of the young people said it wasn't worth going to the trouble of going to the poll, because no matter who wins, Wall Street wins, the 1% wins, and it's not going to affect what happens. But then that itself gives more power to money, because money then has to be used to get out the vote, and they target getting out the vote to those who will support their views. So that's one of the reasons why we've wound up with this kind of distorted democracy that we have. The other reason that I talk about briefly is based on some insights from recent research in behavioral economics, psychology, marketing. Corporations have discovered that they can market goods. A good example is, for instance, the cigarette companies were able to persuade most Americans that there was no credible evidence that cigarettes caused cancer or had other ill health effects, even though the cigarette companies had in their files that evidence. But they were very effective in casting doubt about the nature of the scientific evidence, and people continued to smoke for several decades after the evidence was overwhelming. Well, if you can sell toxic products, you can also sell toxic ideas. And the 1% has both the resources, the tools, the techniques, and the incentives to do that. And that's, again, played a very important role in shaping our politics and helps explain why we wound up with these outcomes that seem so out of line with what you would expect to get in a democratic society. Let me talk just very briefly about two or three other manifestations of this inequality. Not only has it put our democracy at peril, it's also put our system of justice at peril. One of the basic values I think that most Americans take seriously is justice for all. In the Pledge of Allegiance we say justice for all. But in the recent mortgage crisis, the mortgage debacle, what we saw was not justice for all. Many Americans were thrown out of their homes when they didn't owe anything. The banks signed an affidavit, said that they looked at the record and said that this individual owed money. But they were lying. They hadn't looked at the record. This was the robo-signing where they just had somebody sign thousands of these a day. They hadn't looked at the record, and obviously if you hadn't looked at the record, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. Now the bank's response is that most of the people that they threw out of their homes did owe money. Well, that's like a system of justice that says most of the people that get capital punishment were probably guilty. They must have done something wrong. But that's not our system of justice. Innocent until proven guilty, the burden to prove. But the fact of the matter is, after all of this has been brought to light, not one of the people who committed this kind of perjury to the court over and over again, not just once, over and over again, has gone to prison. There is some attempt to get financial reparations that make up for the people who've been thrown out of their homes. But the result of this, if you look, and this is just one example, we've wound up with a system that is better described, not justice for all, but justice for those who can afford it. Now take another issue that's been very big in the United States in recent years, the battle over the budget. How do we bring down the deficit? And if I begin to analyze that problem, I begin with a very simple observation. Just a little over 10 years ago, 2001, the US had a large surplus. So large that Alan Greenspan said that he was worried. He was worried we were going to pay back the entire national debt, and it would be very hard for him to conduct monetary policy with no national debt. You know the details of how monetary policy is conducted. It's buying and selling national debt. Now, you should understand that this was a totally specious argument, and incredible that anybody took Alan Greenspan seriously. But then he was a hero. I cannot believe that if, say, in 2015, those surpluses had persisted and we almost paid down the national debt, Alan Greenspan or his successor could have come to Congress and the administration and say, you know, our country faces a real emergency. You need to spend more to create a debt. You know, I know you don't want to spend, but you know, sacrifice, put your country in front of anybody else, cut taxes, spend more, please, please. I can't believe that Congress would not have responded, and relatively quickly, to this national emergency. But somehow Alan Greenspan said, no, we can't wait until that dire moment. We have to act in 2001 to give a tax cut to the richest Americans. Let's not look at the details of whether we can afford it. Let's get that tax cut right on the books as soon as we can. Well, what that shows you was that macroeconomic policy, monetary economic policy, you know, these independent central bankers really often have a political agenda. They're not these godlike figures who are only worrying about the details of inflation and so forth. But more to the point, if you understand that just over a decade ago we had a surplus, and you see the large deficits, where would a reasonable place of beginning to get rid of the deficits? Well, to ask, how do we go from that surplus to the deficit? And let's see whether we should reverse those. And there are actually only four things. This tax cut that we couldn't afford, especially for the top. 2 very expensive wars that didn't do anything, and a military buildup beyond that, weapons that don't work against enemies that don't exist. That's the good news, that the enemies aren't there. The Cold War is over. The Defense Department doesn't seem to know it yet. Thirdly, a drug benefit for, I mentioned before that we don't bargain with the drug companies, and that's a $500 billion giveaway over 10 years. And finally, probably one of the most important, is the recession. And this is very important. The deficit didn't cause the recession caused the deficit. The best way of getting the deficit down would be put America back to work, to create jobs, to get America functioning again. Well, if you look at the deficit reduction commissions, a whole set of them, what you see is they don't focus on the issues that I've just described. There are all kinds of things. Like, can you imagine a deficit reduction commission that says, let's lower the corporate income tax? Now, how does that help reduce the deficit? Now, I agree you need to reform the tax structure to get rid of all the loopholes. That's important. But lowering the rate, what you should be doing is saying, let's lower the rate on firms that invest in America and raise the rate on firms that don't invest in America. That would provide incentives for the creation of more jobs. Well, I want to conclude by saying, by discussing what is it that we can do about this problem. In the last chapter, I provide an economic agenda. There are many aspects of America's inequality. Too much wealth at the top, too many poor people, people in poverty have increased, a hollowing out of the middle class, and each of these requires its own agenda. There's no magic bullet. There's going to be lots of things. Every law and regulation, like the bankruptcy law, competition law, corporate governance laws that allow CEOs to take a larger share of the pie of the corporations, all of these things help shape the inequality that we have in our society today. And so you can't do just one thing. There are many things, but it's all doable. It's actually not that complicated. And other countries have done one or more of the things that I describe in that agenda. The problem, of course, is the politics. And our political system is distorted, so the question, and works for the 1%, the question is how are we going to reform the politics? So I end in the question, is there hope? And my publisher told me that people don't buy books if there's no hope. They don't want to finish a book and be depressed. It's just not, at least part of the American personality. A few years ago, I think I came here and gave a talk about my book with Linda Bilmes called The $3 Trillion War. And the book was very influential in shaping the debate about the war. When people started using the war, they said the $3 trillion war, and it helped people understand the huge cost of the war. We were very explicit. We had underestimated the cost of the war. In particular, the numbers that have come in since then have shown that we were accurate, and we were right that we had underestimated. Close to 1 out of 2 Americans coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq are disabled, and that's going to cost us $1 trillion in the coming years to pay for their health and disability payments. But anyway, the point is, not that many people bought that book because it was so depressing. So let me end on a note of hope. The United States has had, well, okay, 2 notes of hope. If you look around the world, there are some other countries that have looked over the precipice and said, we don't want to go there. One in particular, Brazil, had very high levels of inequality. And then beginning with President Cardoso, just about 20 years ago, he said, this is not the direction that we want to go. And there was a broad consensus in the society, including the 1%. They understood it was in their enlightened self-interest to do about something about this. Otherwise, their whole society was going to fall apart. And the result of that was a successful program of bringing up education. And then President Lula had a program to make sure there was that the problems of hunger, or the problems of access to health care for poor children was addressed. And remarkably, in 20 years, you can see that Brazil is bringing down the level of inequality. It's been working. So, and today you go visit Brazil, and there is across the spectrum, from business people to unions, a consensus about the direction their economy, their society should be going. In the United States, we've reached high levels of inequality a couple of other times. The Gilded Age, the Roaring '20s. Each time we looked over the precipice and we said, that's not the direction we want to go. The Gilded Age was followed by the Progressive Era, legislation like antitrust legislation. The Roaring '20s was followed by a whole set of legislation, the Wagner Act, Social Security, laws about hours and working conditions that really serve to rebalance our society, reduce the level of inequality. And the question today is, will Americans wake up to the degree of inequality and the lack of equality of opportunity that we have today, and will they pull back from the brink? And the hope of this book is that they will. Thank you.
Let's talk about your Vanity Fair article, because that actually made sense to me. So, your story is that it's in the interest of the 1% to preserve a stable economy. So I want to question some of the statements you made in this talk. I looked at the numbers for when inequality went down, and one time was between 29 and 33, because the stock market collapsed and the real estate market collapsed. And we poor homeless folk, we don't own any real estate, so it didn't hurt us any. And another time the inequality level decrease was between fall 2008 and spring 2009. And that was the same situation. Poor people didn't have any money in the first place. The rich people lost all their money they had in stocks and real estate. So what makes the equality gap go down is actually having an economic collapse. If I was in the 1%, I don't happen to be, but if I was, I would really want to avoid that. You know, I would thank people like Roosevelt who restored capitalism and Obama who restored capitalism again. So how do we help the 1% avoid losing all their money?
Well, let me just make an important reflection on the observation you made, which is because there were all these fluctuations because of cyclical disturbances, that's why we need to look at inequality over longer periods of time. But 10, 20 years is a longer period of time, and therefore the recent data that I began my talk with, where 20 years of wealth accumulation have been wiped out, that's significant. It's not just 3 years, it's 20 years of wealth accumulation. When I said that the median income adjusted for inflation is lower than it was 15 years ago, that's a long period of time. If you ask the question, what's happened to the median income of a full-time male worker? It's lower today than it was in 1968, more than 4 decades ago. These are not just cyclical fluctuations and really speak to the
Sorry, but that's not true either. You're just looking at the United States. If you look at worldwide, people in China are just a lot better off than they are now.
Oh, I was talking about inequality in the United States. There are other countries, I mentioned Brazil, where things are getting better. Poverty is, interesting in China is that poverty has gone down remarkably, but inequality is going up. And that shows you that there are many dimensions to the distribution of income. But I should get the next person. Yeah.
Thanks for your book and for your talk. I have a question about the marketing and propaganda, basically, and I mean that in a positive way, about ideas. It seems that Republicans do a much, much better job peddling their version of the world to all of us than people who are Democrats. And I'll cite 2 examples. One of them is this phrase death tax that was created by Frank Luntz and all of his focus group testing, the Koch brothers and et cetera, they wanted to eliminate the estate tax. Well, that would have to cause other taxes to go up and other bad effects. So they have to find some way to market that to the 99.9% of people who aren't really affected by inheritance tax, or aren't affected very much, I should say. So they came up with this idea of death tax, and they made a big joke of it. Even when we're dying, we pay taxes. Another example, you were on KQED Forum, and you had a gentleman yesterday who called in, and he talked about how half of Americans don't pay any taxes, which is this meme that's been repeated and repeated and repeated on talk radio and on TV. So these are 2 examples where Republicans have found a way to reduce the complexity of economics and all of this in a way that really makes an impact on politics. And I wonder if there's some organizations that are doing it in a way that's consistent with what you write in your book, and which is consistent with my economic values. I agree. The way that we're headed is not good, even for people at the top 1%. We're all going to suffer from this. We're suffering now. So do you agree with my idea that we're kind of losing, we're winning the economics battle, we've got the economics right, but we're losing the propaganda battle?
Yeah.
And what can we do about it? And if I have some money to donate to it, where should I donate?
Well, I agree that this is, in some ways, the key issue. I suppose, and it was one of the reasons I wrote the book, because I wanted to try to crystallize some of the arguments that are wrong in the you might say the conservative interpretation of inequality. So I suppose if you're willing to do something, I would say buy a lot of copies of my book and give them to all your friends and neighbors. But more seriously, there is one Washington think tank that has been very concerned about this issue. It's called the Center for American Progress, of how do we get across this particular set of messages. And in the book, I look at this example of the death duty, and it's astounding. Most Americans opposed the opposed the death duty, even though in the United States, if a married couple will only pay the death duty if their income, their wealth, their bequest exceeds $10 million. Now, there aren't many Americans, certainly not the average American, is facing this dilemma of what to do with their $10 million. I wish it were so, but they simply don't know. Moreover, they've been sold, a lot of these are several myths together. They believe, oh yes, I don't have $10 million now, but we are a land of opportunity, and I'll become one of these guys with $10 million. Anything is possible, but the probability is 0.000001. So it could happen, but it's not likely to happen. So the question is, how do we give a more fact-based discussion? You talk about the bottom, 10%, 50% not paying taxes. That ignores the fact that they pay sales taxes, property taxes, a whole set of other kinds of taxes. So it is really a distortion of the story. So what I've tried to do in the book is to try to explain at least some of those distortions and what the truth about those matters are.
I think that's good, but I still think we need like 2 bumper sticker phrases.
No, I agree. I'm not good at bumper sticker phrases. As you've just seen from my long-winded talk, I'm much better at long-winded answers than bumper stickers.
So the Center for American Progress is a good place to go.
That's right. They're trying very hard. They come out with a little pamphlet, actually, The American Middle Class, Income Inequality, and the Strength of Our Economy, where they try to articulate this in simple terms. But it's where they're trying to go, and they're trying to get, I and people like them are trying to get President Obama who does hopefully have a knack for articulating these things in a way that will have resonance.
Thank you very much.
So you mentioned wanting to leave people with hope. Well, I'm from Wisconsin and was recently involved in the recall movement, so I'm desperately in need of some hope. For those who don't know, in Wisconsin we had a fairly radical anti-union governor who, played with various budget manipulations and, kind of drove the state into a ditch and then blamed it on public employees. And in this recent recall election, the incumbent Scott Walker's side had 7 times the spending on campaign materials and on advertising that his challenger Tom Barrett did. And the majority of that came from very wealthy out-of-state donors, many of whom were able to remain anonymous because they didn't give directly to his campaign, but because they gave to super PACs, which are allowed by the recent Citizens United decision. And this kind of ties in with what the previous person was talking about, but how do we change the political system to promote better outcomes in the economy and less inequality if there is already such a tremendous inequality in the money that goes into the political system? And you have a situation, is our only hope to rely on relatively enlightened 1%ers like, say, Warren Buffett, who have a distaste for super PAC spending, as well they should? What is the path out of it?
Yeah, I think there are 2 that I sort of outline in my book. One of them is that eventually enough of the 1% realize this is not in their interest. And there are people like Warren Buffett who have been very articulate about the dangers of going in the direction that we're going. Not only dangers, but the fundamental inequity that he pays a lower tax rate than his secretary. The other one reflects my other perspective that the 99% might finally begin to realize that they've been sold a bill of goods. That what is in the 1% interest may not be in their interest. Some of it is, but some of it is not. That low tax rates for speculators is not in their interest. There's a whole set of, a system of appropriately designed estate taxes really does help raise needed revenue, enhances equality of opportunity. So there are a whole set of reforms that it should be possible to articulate that the 99% will realize is in their interest, and that there is this potential conflict, and that will change our democratic process. We're still our democracy, and we still have the potential of changing the legislation.
So I'm sympathetic to the argument that wealth inequalities can be economically inefficient, but isn't it dangerous to talk about the 1% because that doesn't, it sort of conflates income and wealth, which are very different things, and also it sort of presents the 1% as a homogenous group, where people at the bottom end of that, which are not poor by any means, they're still not going to buy any influence in Washington, whereas the upper percentiles of the 1% are qualitatively different. So why do you use the term 1% in the West?
Oh, I use it because you have to simplify. In the book, I raise exactly the point. When I use the word 1%, I'm using it generically for something about the top, and some of those. And I do make the point that the 1% in wealth is not the same as the 1% in income, and that.
But don't those have fundamentally different remedies? Like the only way you're ever going to penalize the Walton heirs is through an estate tax. There's no income tax that will ever change that inequality.
Yeah, let me just one of the numbers that I mentioned in the book that it's gotten a lot of resonance is the fact that the 6 heirs of the Walton fortune have as much money, much wealth as the bottom 30% of America. And that is a testimony both to the wealth at the top and to the lack of wealth at the bottom. But you're absolutely right. That's something that's going to need estate tax. And what I said was that we have many dimensions of inequality in our society, and each of them requires their own remedy. We also have inequality in health outcomes. And that the remedy of that is a better healthcare system. So there are many of these dimensions, and obviously in a short talk I couldn't go into all of them. Also, you're absolutely right that it's unfair to the 1% to lump them all together. I mentioned that Warren Buffett has actually been very articulate in saying that we ought to do, the system of taxation is unfair. He even addressed the issue of class warfare when he said, because one of the reactions to some of the statements that I've made and others like it is you're fomenting class warfare. And his response was, and this is from somebody at the very top, he said, we've had class warfare for a very long time and our class has been winning. And so he gave, I think, a perspective on what is at stake. This is not about class warfare. This is about how you make our society work better.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm straying a little bit off topic here, but I'm wondering, as an economist who's focused on inequality from an economic standpoint, how do you feel about Obama's nomination for World Bank president?
It's an interesting nomination. I don't know if you know. The first point I make is that the G20 had agreed that the next president of the World Bank ought to be chosen on the basis of merit. That traditionally it's always based on, it's always been an American, and they said, why does America have the monopoly on talented people? There's actually a world out there, and we ought to open it up. And the U.S. agreed to that, sort of. And everybody had expected this case would be one where countries would put forward good candidates and there would be an open and fair competition. Well, it turned out that it was more open than there had previously been. There were 2 very good candidates from developing countries, Jose Antonio Campo from Colombia and Ngozi from Nigeria, both really outstanding people who would have made good presidents of the World Bank, both with a lot of experience, both who had served as senior ministers in their government, head of foreign policy, head of economics, so a lot of experience. In the end, the United States said, we didn't really mean chosen on the basis of merit. We meant a good American, as opposed to somebody like Wolfowitz, who was not a good American. The good news of the G20 was the administration had been considering appointing somebody who would have been a disaster. And the fact that there was a more open process meant that everybody could pile in and tell Obama, don't do that. That will be a mistake. And there was, a lot of press discussion. And he decided not to appoint that person. At the last minute, he got the guy that he chose, a person who's done fantastic work in the area of health. At least a lot of people say. You don't, but that's only one part of the portfolio of the World Bank. And so the concern is that it's not sufficiently broad relative to the needs of what the World Bank. But we'll see how that evolves.
Hi. So I've done some reading and research on the relationship, if any, between a country's ethnic fractionalization or the ethnic or racial relations in a country and its economic growth, especially with variables like corruption or like rent seeking, like you talked about earlier. So I'm just wondering what your perspective is on that type of research, like what your perspective is on the theory and how you think it's maybe relevant to the U.S. and inequality. Yeah,
that's actually an interesting, there is this body of research that basically is focused on different how societies work together and the extent to which there can be ethnic divisions, a lot in Africa where you have tribal divisions. Some interesting aspects of it is when you have 2 or 3 groups, things work worse than if there's either one group or very many groups. I think it's relevant in the following sense that it is clear that some more homogeneous societies like the Scandinavian countries have managed to have a higher degree of cohesiveness, have much broader policies that support greater equality, and have grown together. But I think at the same time, while America is a very diverse society, there's absolutely nothing about any of the policies that I've described here that couldn't be implemented in a very diverse society.
Thank you.
Hi. You made a persuasive point about how rent-seeking can shrink the economic pie. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about whether labor unions exhibit rent-seeking behavior and how that affects the economy.
That's a good question. Labor unions have played both an important and in some cases an ambiguous role. The reason that unions originally grew to the importance that they have is that there was an imbalance in economic power, particularly bargaining power. When in the introduction it was talked about game theory. The standard economic models pretend that there is perfect competition and there's just a supply of labor and a demand for labor and everything works out very smoothly. The reality is not, that doesn't describe the reality. There is differences in bargaining power. And again, one of the points I make in the book is that the rules and regulations of how we run our economy affect that bargaining power. For instance, when we run globalization in a way that we say that capital and goods can move anywhere in the world, but labor can't, that affects bargaining power, because a firm bargaining with workers can say to the workers, if you don't take lower wages, we're going to move somewhere else and then we're going to be able to bring the goods back home. So it totally distorts the bargaining power. I tell my students, think of another world with a different set of rules. Let's assume that we had a set of rules that capital couldn't move, but skilled labor could. So an economy would have to compete for skilled labor. And so they would compete by having good schools, good environment, totally different world than the world that we live in. So the important lesson of this is the rules and regulations do affect the bargaining power. In that kind of a world, unions have played an important role in trying to redress the imbalance that has emerged naturally and out of the distortions in the rules and regulations. Now, there are some cases where they themselves have high bargaining power and have tried to use that for obviously the benefit of their members, and particularly sometimes their older members. And that's had an adverse effect. The point of that is you don't say, let's get rid of all unions. You have to understand the role that unions play and try to correct the problems that have arisen in those unions.
Not a question, but a thank you for coming to Google.